So, welcome to this episode of 22nd Century Management with Ken. Whether you're listening on the podcast or you're watching it on YouTube, do me a favor, either follow me or hit the subscribe button. I will say that if you have any questions to ask my guest, Ruben, you can put them in the comments and I'll make sure that he gets the questions and we get you the answer back. So, Ruben is an expert in data decision making and the author of the Data Mirage. He helps medium-sized and large enterprises, including the Fortune 1000, find their hidden treasures and use them to boost performance significantly, increase profitability, dramatically lower costs, and make their teams world-class. He's done this globally across 5 continents with some of the most innovative companies. So that was a mouthful, Ruben. Tell us a little more about yourself.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Ken. Thanks again for that intro. I guess I would add that I got into this field as an engineer. When I was a kid, I learned how to code. I taught myself how to code. And to me, data is fascinating because it's very technical, but it's really mostly used by non-technical folks, marketing teams, sales teams, and so on. And I realized companies have a lot of potential in using their data, which they have tons of, right? Companies are drowning in data. So be able to turn all that into insights. And I think that's what I fundamentally do with companies and readers who read my blog and newsletters and things like that.
Okay. So why did you write this book, Data Mirage?
Well, after 5 years of working with clients, I thought, there's so many questions that keep coming up over and over again. There's only so many people I can actually work with. I think there's probably something here for a book or enough for a book. And I also thought when I looked at the sort of book space of the data, there wasn't really anything that covered what I wanted to talk about, which is really the sort of psychology or the human element of data. I think the technology portion, vendors, CDPs, BI tools, whatever we could talk about here, is mostly straightforward. It gets easier year by year as technology gets better. But the people, how people actually consume data, do they trust the numbers? Can they make a decision on those numbers? And then how do companies turn their data into insights? I thought that was underserved. So I thought, what? I'll write the book. I'll focus on that. I'll have a little bit of technology, but the bulk of the book is focused on how to work with your team and get more insight from your team.
It's interesting because I operate in a world that is very data-driven in the copier industry. But it amazes me how many times people don't understand the right questions to ask when they're looking at their data, and that's part of what I share with individuals. So let me ask you this question then. What do you think the best companies do with their data that others don't?
Well, there's a few things. Everyone starts at roughly the same place with lots of data and a lot of collection of data. What companies do differently, or what the best companies do differently, one is they make it available to everyone in as many formats as possible. So the classic data report is a dashboard. But dashboard is a bit of an old idea, in my opinion. Now you need to have data available in raw formats, like a CSV, like an Excel. It should be an email digest, like an email summary. It should be available on Slack or whatever chat tool they use. There should be meetings where you can talk about data and people can bring their questions. So there's all these different formats and data is available everywhere, and people can almost metaphorically trip on it. If you think about 10,000 steps, a very popular idea in fitness right now, and a lot of people track their steps now. It's quite easy to do it, right? It's on your watch. You can check it. You can go do it. You can plan around it. So I think that's a great example of data that is just right, timely, and actually changes your behavior, which is really what we want. So companies, I think, are doing those things to make data accessible. The second thing I think the best companies do well is they think about the future. So naturally, a lot of data is about the past, what happened with the campaign last week, last month, last quarter. But I think the best companies are starting to say, how can we use this to better understand the future? How can we automate what customers might want to ask us? Or how can we deliver a product that customers might want? This is sort of the world of machine learning, data science, which we can talk about. But there's a lot of different ways to sort of slice it, this future aspect. And the third, I would say they work on trust, right? So say they maintain the trust in the data. I'm sure you've seen examples of people who say, I don't trust this number doesn't make sense. And that is, catastrophic. If you lose trust in the data, then everything just falls apart.
Exactly, because as the world's becoming more data driven, if you don't trust what you see, it becomes a real challenge. It's interesting what you just said too, because one of the things that I'm teaching the managers in my class to do is to start modeling what the future might look like. And I show them how they can just build a fairly simple model and use the data they have and then start to, let's say, play games with the variables. So if, for example, we make more copies next year, what does that do to my staffing requirements? If I can get a little better at fixing the copier, what does that do to my requirements? What does it do to the profitability? And I think that's a really important tool for managers to learn to use the data they have, what they know about now, to be able to plan what they're going to need to do in the future. So I thought that was a very interesting point there. What would you say some of the biggest misconceptions are around data?
I think the first one, maybe building up on one of the points we just spoke about, is that it's subjective and it's just facts. Sort of give the facts to people and they'll see your way, right? And I think we're living in this massive event of COVID-19 that has proven this completely false. There's being clear aligned interpretation as to what numbers mean. What should governments do? Should they lock down? Should they not? Here in Vancouver, there's an anti-mask protest every week, nearly every week, and it was much more during the height of COVID-19. So clearly, there's a group of people, whether it's large or not, we could debate that, but they don't see facts in the same way we all do. And I think the same thing happens for companies. Their numbers aren't just numbers. There's interest, there's ego, there's things we want to happen. How can we tweak the numbers so it kind of tells us what we want to hear? The second thing I think about data is that there's a sense that you want to capture as much as possible. I think that's been the driving force for 20 years. Collect as much as possible, you store it, and then you figure out what to do with it. And of course, companies are starting to realize that it's not really helping them. It's simply costing them money. So try to think first of how you're actually going to use the data and then collect it is sometimes a more efficient route. And the third thing I will say about just data in general is trying to perhaps be too focused on the reports and the dashboards and forgetting that data, at the end of the day, it's really just a means to an end, right? And the means to an end is making a decision, launching a campaign, optimizing your sales process. So how you get there, whether you get there with an amazing dashboard that's real time and slices everything in so many different ways, or whether you get there with just some basic numbers, basic KPIs, it probably doesn't matter as much as long as you actually get there.
Okay. Yeah. But those dashboards are shiny and fun.
I mean, they are, and I love building them. But as long as it doesn't get in the way of you making a decision, right? You're doing something. But if you think sort of the outcome is a dashboard, then you're likely going to be disappointed. But you have a very nice, you'll know exactly what's going on. You're just going to be going in the right direction.
Okay. So what should companies know about the current trends in data?
Yeah. So a few things, especially very timely right now. One is privacy. Again, for a long time, data was sort of this wild west, collect everything, doesn't matter. Now we're seeing an increase in privacy. We see Apple taking a stronger stance. We see privacy regulations like the CCPA in California, GDPR. So being mindful of privacy, data leaks, what those might do to your company. Very high priority for companies now, especially if you deal with a lot of sensitive data. I'm thinking financial industries, healthcare for a long time has been aware of this, but now there's an even greater sense of companies who store credit cards and social insurance numbers and things like that.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. It's one of those things that you always think about. That you see the cookie announcement on the website. You're like, okay, do I want to let them have a cookie or not?
Yeah.
And it's funny too, because I also use cookies the other direction to find out information from people that visit my website, to try to understand things. So it's a two-way stream. Okay. So do you think that all companies should strive to be data-driven?
You know what? I don't. I think data-driven has been this phrase that's been used for a long time. I talk in the book about companies being data supported. And I think that gets to that previous point I was saying, where let data play a role in helping you make decisions, understand what's going on, but it shouldn't be the driving force. When I think about driving force in a company that's truly data-driven, I think about Google and Facebook, where their main product is really data. That is everything around it. If you look at Google, right, Gmail, Google Maps, Android, is designed to capture data and then use that to do advertising. And you look at Google and Facebook 15, 20 years later after it's founded, their revenue models are still highly dependent on advertising. It's something like 70, 80% for both of them. So to me, that's a company that's driven by data and they need the data. But other companies, I don't think is the case. And you want data to just be almost like training wheels, like a light, like a flashlight in the dark cave. But you should still be able to make decisions without it. You still focus on building better products, helping your customers, things like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about helping your customers, because in so many businesses, the hardest thing to measure is how well you're really taking care of your customers. I gave a speech recently and I talked about the fact that I see all of these customer satisfaction metrics that people share. And the point I made in the conversation was stop asking fluff questions, because most people, they ask the questions they know their customers will give them really good answers to. And it looks pretty, but it doesn't tell you anything. They need to ask the hard questions. What don't you like about doing business with us? That's important data. The fact that your customer had a good time with this particular item is not particularly helpful data.
Yeah, you know what? I'm sure you've seen the NPS, right? Being a very popular customer support metric. And I think it, like you mentioned, it misses a few things, but it's quite popular. I think the simplicity of it is what attracts companies, but it might not actually help them improve their products.
Yeah, exactly. It looks good and it may draw in customers. I'm not saying it doesn't have any value, but I'm saying that it doesn't do what they really need it to do. And that's help them identify how to get better. Because that's the question every company should be asking is, how do we get better than we are today? How do we take better care of our customers, better care of our employees? So let me ask a final question here. Do you think that all executives should become data proficient?
Yes. For a long time, I always thought that wasn't the case. But I think in the last couple of years, I've seen a big change in how leadership teams manage companies. And I think with a pandemic, it's inescapable, right? To now not understand technology, not understand data, not understand your numbers, whether you're marketing, operations, sales, doesn't matter. So I do think all executives need to go through a basic educational training process program around basic statistics, how to look at numbers, how to make sure the numbers aren't lying to you. All those different skills, I think, need to be eventually be built into an executive team. And you can't just rely on someone else to tell you what this means. Right. I think that's going to be a major difference for executive teams in the next 5 years.
And I would agree. And I think it's also one of the things that they need to teach their managers downstream. I think that any first level manager should at least have some exposure to understanding numbers and modeling, because if you can start doing that at the grassroots, then you start to build a cadre of future executives that'll get to the C-suite, that'll have the skills and be well versed in how to do it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm not saying that our managers should become data analysts. That's not the point here. But to have a basic grasp, to be able to take some basic numbers, put them in Excel or Google Sheets or whatever you might use, do those basic models, I think it's helpful. And if you don't have them, what then occurs is that you have to go to a data analyst. You have to wait weeks to get that answer back. And you might just need something simple, right? So the speed at which you can do things slows down, because you're not able to, to run through some basic statistics.
Yep, I would agree 100% with that, Ruben. And I want to thank you, Ruben, for being on the show. I will remind everybody that you do have a book, The Data Mirage, and I'm sure it's available on Amazon. And what I'll do is I'll put a link in the show notes or in the description on YouTube so that you can find that link and get a copy of Ruben's book easily. I'll also put a link to his website so that anybody that's interested can reach out and get a hold of Ruben and start to benefit from his expertise. And again, Ruben, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ken. It was a pleasure.
And again, if you haven't already done so, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and the notify so you'll know when the next episode comes out. We'll see you next week.